It'd be great if I could pause my bladder for the duration of the show, or temporarily switch off my body, or get rid of it altogether. After all, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place if we didn't have bodies. Our bodies are biohazards. This body has been with me for 41 years. It weighs approximately 76 kilos and tends to be called Mark O'Connell. When people see it, they say things like, "Hi, Mark," or "Hey, Mark." But sometimes they say, "Mark?" I have a lot of sympathy with the last position. I often look in the mirror and question myself. I look at my reflection and struggle to recognize the person staring back at me. Somehow I feel like I don't fit this face. It's fine, my face. It just sometimes feels like I could just as easily have a different face, or even a different body, and still be Mark, or at least still be Mark. It was thoughts like this that often occur when staring at myself in the mirror that set me off on a journey to meet a community of people that believe it's only when we get rid of our bodies that we become our true selves.
At Ireland's Edge. If you're a little bit shook after that rather existential 2 minutes, fear not, we're going to unpack that with you here. The clip we just saw is from To Be a Machine 1.0, which was co-commissioned by the Science Gallery in Dublin and Dublin Theatre Festival, and was premiered earlier this year at Dublin Theatre Festival. The piece itself is a theatre adaptation of Mark O'Connell's critically acclaimed non-fiction book, To Be a Machine, which was adapted by Dead Centre. And I'm joined here this evening by Moukarzel of Dead Centre and Mark O'Connell. So with that clip kind of left us maybe on a sort of a cliffhanger of transhumanism. Could you unpack for us a little bit what transhumanism is?
Yeah, well, transhumanism, as I understand it, is really this quite extraordinary social movement that's predicated on the notion that the next sort of phase of human evolution will involve a merger with technology, and that merger will allow us to sort of push out the boundaries of the human condition, become smarter, extend our lifespans, and maybe even become immortal. So it's a pretty extreme kind of sci-fi-ish idea, but it's something that has like a really solid constituency in Silicon Valley, in particular, maybe unsurprisingly, because that's sort of a dream factory of quite sort of crazy moonshot ideas. But yeah, in my book I spent really a couple of years just going out and meeting people who subscribe to these ideas, who are transhumanists, and sort of finding out what makes them tick.
And Bush, tell me, what was it about transhumanism that drew you towards this book to adapt it for stage?
Well, it was the book itself. The reason was Mark's writing, the style. He's a funny writer, which is always a good start. And there's this clear voice in it, so that it sort of lent itself to sort of a character, a theatrical. The narrator really stands out in the book because Mark filters all these strange ideas through his own subjective experience. And so that was why we were keen to adapt it to stage. And then the question about how to tell the story of transhumanism, well, at the heart of theatre is the body. It seems to always seem to be the sort of essential element. It's been what's mourned this year when we've lost the live events, it's that we can't gather as bodies in a room. So I'm always keen to investigate what happens if you take away the essential element of the art form, and what happens. Does it die, or can it survive? So kind of curious to see, experiment with that.
And I'd be interested to hear I guess, how you begun your creative process together. So how did you decide which of the many transhumanists you met made it into the theatre piece?
Yeah, well, that was a kind of, I mean, there were so many fun characters to choose from, but you got to go with some of the big hitters. Like, it wouldn't really be a piece on transhumanism if you didn't go to the bodies in the desert, frozen in vats of hydrogen or nitrogen, excuse me, and then
absolutely. And what's the word for that again?
Cryonics.
Cryonics.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, it's an open question as to whether it does work, and it's sort of predicated on the notion that it might work in the future. So, but the principle of the thing is, you die, and as quickly as possible, your body is brought to one of the very small number of cryonics facilities in the world, and a series of procedures happen to your recently deceased body, involving replacing all the fluids in your body with like anticoagulants and antifreeze and so on, and you were basically, long story short, body is preserved in a gigantic sort of, really a gigantic thermos flask filled with liquid nitrogen, and most patients are beheaded actually, because it's cheaper to just freeze the head than the whole body. And the idea at the end of it is that at some point in the future, technology will become sophisticated enough that we'll be able to crack open the skull and reconstitute the actual person from the thawed brain. So yeah, it's pretty out there stuff.
And as it stands, this is a notional belief, a kind of blind faith of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, it's on that sort of strange inflection point between the scientific and the religious. I've sort of got in trouble in the past for referring to it as a pseudoscience. And it maybe isn't actually a pseudoscience, because there are scientists who believe that, the principle is somewhat sound. I mean, to be fair, most scientists think it's so far-fetched as to not even really be worth thinking about. But of all the people who I spoke to, most transhumanists, it's not that they don't take it seriously. They think it's the best prospect that we have right now for bringing ourselves back from the dead. So why not give it a shot? If you don't do it, you're definitely not coming back. If you do it, well, probably you're not coming back. But there's a sliver of a chance. So let's.
And what do you think? What do you think triggers transhumanism in a person? Do you think somebody is maybe prone to adopt such a belief system, or?
I guess it's a fear of death seems to be a big part of it. However, how acute that is in you, or one, would lead you to seek get-out clauses. Transhumanism seems to be one. Also, because it's technology-based, so it's a way of putting your faith in technology as a religion. So I suppose it's whoever gets to the end of the day of a load of Zoom calls and doesn't feel that burnout and is ready to keep Zooming all night, then that's probably a good starter sign. We might have a transhumanist on our hands. So I think somebody, a mixture of those factors.
Fear and faith. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. It's a combination of those two things: fear of death, faith in technology. You've got yourself a transhumanist.
And do you see transhumanism as being somewhat maybe an evolution of religious beliefs that are rooted in eternal life, or is it something that a belief system that perhaps runs in parallel?
Yeah, I mean, there are transhumanists who are also religious, but it's a pretty small subsection. By and large, transhumanists tend to think of themselves as very kind of rigorous rationalists, extreme believers in reason and.
But there's that crossover of like body suspicion. That happens
that's
in
right.
a lot of religions.
Unpack that a bit for me. Body suspicion.
Well, the way that the sort of the body is seen to be something fallible and the site of sin and the lower aspect, and that we need to elevate ourselves into some sort of rational.
The corruption of the flesh.
This kind of narrative, which obviously has a lot of strange. Kind of politics linked to it, often the way that women's bodies are policed a lot of the time, or women associated with the body, and then men as this sort of rational, kind of these kind of old ideas, which are so dangerous and frankly, mixed. You see some of that creeping into transhumanism as well. It's not by accident that a lot of the major figures in the transhumanist movement are men.
Absolutely.
And that you have this kind of carry on, this old idea finding a new form. That somehow the body is something to be denied and overcome.
And it's like
strange,
this idea that like this is not me, like I'm thought, I am consciousness or the soul or whatever it is. This is just a vessel. I think that's something that religions and transhumanism definitely hold
And
in common.
do you think that the ego is central to be able to hold down and lock down a firm transhumanist belief?
Unpack that for me.
So I find it interesting that the majority of transhumanists that I came across in your book mostly happen to be men. I think bar one.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is that an acquired sense of self within the world, and drawing on I guess those old religious archetypes of Eve being tossed out of the garden, but most men being painted as patriarchally infallible. Do you think that in any way trickles into a belief system?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many ways of looking at this, and obviously, like as soon as I started to look into transhumanism and meet these people, I mean, it became very apparent very soon that the overwhelming majority of them were men. Like, in one sense, it could be just a sort of a demographic issue, in the sense that Silicon Valley is really where most of this stuff is happening, and the tech world tends to overrepresent men. But I think there's something beyond that, and I think Bush kind of touched on it as well, which is this like discomfort with the body. Or I think there's something about the delusion, for want of a better word, that our existence, or one's existence, could be boiled down to pure thought, pure reason. This idea of like mind-body dualism or whatever.
That we are just data.
Right, that we are just data. That something about that delusion might be more appealing to a certain kind of male way of thinking. I mean, you can tell the way I'm talking here. I'm sort of like I'm hedging, because you have to get into kind of gender essentialism at some level when you start talking about this stuff. But yeah, I think maybe there's a sense in which women typically are more at ease with the contingency of the body, with the difficulties of having to live in a flesh and blood body. Possibly that's it.
And of these transhumanists that you met, and of these transhumanists' minds that you delved into through the process of creating this piece, do you think it's is it quite as simple as it being a fear of experiencing death as oneself, or is it a fear of maybe the notion of death and a fear of having to grieve the deaths of those that you love? So if one was to adopt a transhumanist perspective, are you maybe somewhat absolved from maybe the magnitude of grief, in that you might feel there's a loophole of sorts?
Well, grief is just one of the many sort of earthly emotions that our transhumanists are just trying to like get over all of that stuff. They're like the whole messy day-to-day, being bored, being kind of high and low. All this stuff is the transhumanists are driven by. We mustn't forget, whatever we analyze the background of where they might be coming from, the catalyst for them becoming transhumanists, they also just believe it's going to work. That the technology will
override these emotions.
Exactly. Will just allow us to escape a phase of human existence, where we were subject to emotions, and and they sort of just have a blind belief that it will be possible to become a machine.
And I think transhumanists, it's not that they believe that we should become machines, it's that they believe that on some level we already are machines. It's just that we are really like insufficient to the task. We're quite sort of primitive machines in all the ways that Bush has just sort of outlined, and so the task is to upgrade. The task is to,
Yeah, there's one cyborg. Well, he calls himself a cyborg. He's into body augmentation that we meet in the book, called Tim Cannon, and he sort of put a device in his arm, so it's a sort of internal thermostat. So, whatever temperature the room is, it can adjust his thermostat, or whatever his body temperature is. So
sends signals to the thermostat.
Sends signals out to the thermostat and adjusts it. But he asks the the question, well, if you wear glasses, you know, or if you have a hearing aid, or a kind of, if you are fitted with a coil, or use a wheelchair, we all different types of body augmentation. Says, well, this is already type of cyborg reality, and we, you know, he said for him it's just a sort of logical extension of that kind of attitude towards augmenting ourselves to improve our lives, that would lead to a total replacement of the body with a sort of cyborg alternative, you know.
I suppose I have to confess to some biohacking on my part. I'm fitted with the bar of Implanon, which is a contraceptive bar.
Okay.
So I guess that makes me technically a cyborg.
I guess, yeah, it's on a spectrum for sure. Yeah.
And I'm wearing orthotics in my shoes, so
therefore
frankly,
you're
a
hardcore
more
biohacker.
or less the Terminator right now. Yeah.
And would you ever consider implementing biohacking into your creative and sort of creative process?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know exactly if that comes about. Maybe in the next version of this show, the next iteration, we might look into those kind of things. If we found an actor willing enough to allow themselves to be biohacked, then maybe it might be a bit ethically dubious. But we'll look at that. We'll get into the contracts on that later. But with this show, the point was to try to see where technology and art can speak to each other. And in the context of COVID, you know, what was initially seen, and of course there's a major catastrophe of the fact that we can't gather and that all the shows had to go online, that was initially seen as a bad thing, and everyone was mourning that this isn't the real thing. And of course, we just tried to turn a problem into an opportunity to meditate on, is there, although it's clear what is lost, is there another way? What's gained in that loss? Is there a way that loss can speak to something? So in this show, we had the audience upload themselves into iPads. So the performer, Jack Gleeson, was looking out onto an audience of 110 iPads, and the people watching at home could sort of see themselves in this disembodied way, and there's ways of interacting with that experience that wouldn't happen if they were there. So it sort of can speak to some of the ideas of transhumanism and disembodied beings in a way you simply couldn't do that. So I don't know. I'm always interested in what technology will allow, how it will allow you to expand the art form, you know, and discover different possibilities.
I think we got really lucky with the virus in a way that it allowed us to like explore the themes of the book in a way that we might not have done.
Yeah, probably wouldn't have occurred. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like Senator Moran was saying in the last talk here, that the digital divide she spoke about, there's a lot of dangers with the brave new world of what live streaming allows for. I think Naomi Klein spoke about used the phrase "the Screen New Deal" as well. There's sort of the new hierarchies in politics that come in, but of course there's a lot of those hierarchies and inequalities are in place in the traditional format as well. When you go into the theatre, whether there's issues of accessibility or economic barriers for who can go and see what shows, or educational barriers of what makes somebody feel comfortable in that environment, a lot of those are dissipated when somebody can stay at home and feel suddenly they are welcome and part of the audience of that particular show. So, you know, there's opportunities.
And what did it feel like to have a disembodied audience in an empty theatre? Was that intimacy still present in the performance space, or? Yeah,
it was curious. I mean, before each show, just before it started, we turned on our audience in the literal sense of that. Hopefully, finally, we got them worked up in a happy way too. But they were turned on, and Jack would go and see who was in for the evening, and he'd look at all these screens, and he'd, oh God, my sister's okay, cool. Oh, my agent, damn it, I better get this right tonight. And there was a sort of sense in which he felt a responsibility to the audience, even though they were in a remote form. So that was interesting, and they were still there in a way, and you were still aware. Also, I appreciated them not being there at the end. You didn't go for endless drinks after each performance. That was better for my liver as well, having a remote audience, I have to say.
In much better post-production shape.
Big time, yeah.
But I think that there was something really intimate about it as well, despite the extreme level of technological mediation. Just watching it on a laptop, the faces, the audience's faces, there's a real intimacy in those like moments where, you know, the audience have given us this thing, you know, uploaded themselves to the show, and, you know, there's moments of them with their eyes closed and laughing and staring, and there's a real intimacy, I think, in a way that, yeah, transcends the technological limitations in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And through the process of creating this piece, would you find yourself swayed to be a transhumanist?
Well, I'm always picked Ben Kidd, my colleague, who's co-artistic director of Dead Center, and Mark. They always sort of pick on me and call me the transhumanist because I seem to be more amenable to some of the positions.
He's a susceptibility to it.
I'm not a card carrying, but I see the sort of endpoint. You sort of see that with the tendencies of that we are all trying to make. You know, the whole of society is trying to become more efficient always, and like, you know, we always try to save time in everything we're doing in our lives. So you can sort of see the tendencies that we're on, and a lot of them we subscribe to, wittingly or unwittingly. So I think there's a part of it. And sure, I wouldn't mind sticking around a bit longer than my however many years I'm allotted. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm fully signed up. How about, what's your sense of that?
Well, I'm sort of reserving judgment. And in a way, like the ideal version of the book when I wrote it for me would have been a version in which I begin my sort of journey, for want of a better term, into this world skeptic, and then, you know, have that skepticism questioned and broken down at every step of the way, and then finally have a kind of a, you know, Damascene conversion moment, or whatever the term is. And that didn't happen. You know, I remained open-minded, but basically sort of unsold on the idea of transhumanism. But in a way, I began from I mean, I would never have written the book if I just wanted to debunk it, or, you know, prove it to be, you know, fallacious or foolish, or, you know, I began with a kernel of identification, I think, and, you know, for reasons that we've talked about, you know, none of us really want to die, you know, we're all in one way or another in a sort of uncomfortable relationship with our own mortality, and there was something really fascinating to me about the idea of people who are out there not just having sort of existential conversations about it, or, you know, having, you know, dark nights of the soul, but actually rolling up their sleeves and saying, well, we've got some technology, we've got some money, let's see what we can do about this. That's really fascinating to me. And so there's a certain amount of, you know, identification there. And what's been really interesting about working with Bush and with Ben is that, like, in a way, Bush is kind of like a step further down that road, I suppose, towards being open to transhumanism. And so that, like, what he brought to it, amongst other things, was that sort of, well, let's see what it would be like to occupy that position. And so
I feel like we've just outed you as a transhumanist.
Yeah,
it's okay. My mum's not watching.
He's not actually here. This isn't uploaded.
And do you think there's a way of being, you know, maybe not quite a hardcore transhumanist? You know, maybe you mightn't invest in being beheaded and put into a tub of nitrogen, but do you think there are positive, you know, values systems embedded within transhumanism that could be adapted on maybe like a more low-key transhumanist level?
Well, it depends on how you define it. I mean, there's a way of defining transhumanism where you would sort of categorize it so broadly that it's almost indistinguishable from medical science, because really what you're talking about is just improving the human condition and, like, pushing out sort of the boundary of mortality. And that's really what, you know, medical scientists, doctors have been doing for, you know, centuries in some form or another. But I think there is something qualitatively different about transhumanism, which is that, you know, at the most extreme edge, and really the most interesting edge, they want to discard the body entirely. They want to move on to some other way of being human, or even not being human at all. So it's difficult to say whether that is, you know, whether there are good things to be taken from that. There are so many elements of humanity that are, you know, to use a transhumanist term, suboptimal. It's a bit, I think of it sometimes as a bit like, you know, the space program or something. You know, maybe we're not going to get to Mars, but you know, maybe we're not going to colonize other planets, but there might be technologies that might sort of be generated by those efforts that might be useful to other things. But I think I'm still ultimately, I think I still see it as being
a folly.
I don't know if I would put it quite that bluntly, but yeah, an interesting folly. But it's like, if it is a folly, it's a folly that reveals certain crucial aspects of our culture, of capitalism, and in some ways of just humanity itself. There's like nothing new really about any of this. It's as old as humanity, the desire to transcend humanity.
And through this process of exploring transcending in the form of transhumanism, have you discovered any, maybe antidotes to transhumanism, but other forms of let's say, transcending, in order to maybe, be able to sit with the issue of this old existential dread, which somewhat underpins the piece?
Have we found it like in our private lives? Have we found a meditative space?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the art of dying basically is the sort of antidote, the opposite. If the whole of transhumanism isn't a drive to escape dying, but actually to succumb, accept, and die well, and die together, can be a nice thing. And the theatre is a way of dying, as we say in the show. We come together to die in real time. And so everybody in the theatre, when you sit together, are dying at the same time. And we do, and we can synchronize, and that is kind of a beautiful thing. But it doesn't mean much, but it has poetic resonance. So but the transhumanists would have no truck for that, because there's no use. It doesn't mean it. It's useless data, but it's not useless if you're the one dying. It's the most meaningful data there is. So yeah, there's sort of the importance of meaninglessness as well is sort of the theatre and art's antidote to the ultra-utilitarian mindset of transhumanism.
And I believe To Be a Machine 2.1.0 we'll be having another outing soon.
That's right.
Another chance to die within the theatre.
That's the plan. We are going to the Berg Theatre in Vienna. I'm flying out in a couple of days to make a German language version, which will have a premiere on New Year's Eve. Yeah.
Excellent. And any other plans to develop further into a 2.0?
Yeah, we were going to keep working with our video designer and technical director, Jack Gleeson, who's just a kind of whiz, and might double down on the digital opportunity and make an app. We were thinking of making an app whereby the audience can pick the costume, the setting, the music, and then score it themselves, and you can have a sort of subjective experience of being not at the theatre.
Excellent. Well, we greatly look forward to watching the evolution of To Be a Machine, and thank you both very much for joining us this evening.